In the early 1940s, in a quiet region of southern Poland, a place once known simply as Auschwitz was transformed into something far darker. Under Nazi occupation, it was renamed Auschwitz, and what began as a detention site for political prisoners quickly evolved into one of the most infamous locations in human history. The camp was not initially designed as an extermination center. In 1940, its first prisoners were primarily Polish resistance members, intellectuals, and those considered a threat to German control. They were transported in overcrowded trains, often beaten upon arrival, and registered with numbers that would soon replace their names. The infrastructure grew rapidly. Barbed wire fences, watchtowers, and barracks spread across the area with chilling efficiency. By 1941, Auschwitz had already become a symbol of terror in occupied Europe, but its true purpose was still unfolding behind guarded gates and carefully controlled narratives. Orders came from the highest levels of the Nazi regime, and the camp's expansion was not random. It was systematic, planned, and driven by ideology. Nearby, a second camp, Auschwitz-Birkenau, was under construction, designed on a scale that hinted at something far beyond imprisonment. The location was chosen deliberately. Railway access made it ideal for mass transport, while its relative isolation ensured secrecy. For those who arrived, confusion was immediate. Families were separated within minutes. Men, women, and children were divided by SS officers who made split-second decisions that determined life or death, though few understood it at the time. To the outside world, Auschwitz was described in vague bureaucratic terms: a labor camp, a relocation center. But behind the barbed wire, a different reality was beginning to take shape, one that would soon become central to the Nazi regime's most extreme policies. If you want to understand what really happened behind places like Auschwitz, beyond simplified narratives and fragmented history, this channel is dedicated to uncovering those realities through documented events and carefully reconstructed timelines. Each story we cover is based on historical records, testimonies, and verified sources, aiming to present the Second World War as it truly unfolded, without exaggeration or distortion. Subscribing ensures you don't miss these deeper explorations into one of history's most complex and devastating conflicts. As Auschwitz expanded into a network of camps, its function shifted in ways that were not publicly acknowledged. By late 1941 and into 1942, the Nazi regime had begun implementing what they referred to as the final solution, a coordinated plan to systematically eliminate Europe's Jewish population. Auschwitz, particularly Birkenau, became a central site in this operation. Gas chambers were constructed and disguised as shower facilities, and crematoria were built to dispose of bodies at an industrial scale. Yet even within the camp, many prisoners had no full understanding of what was happening. Deception was constant. New arrivals were told they were being relocated or processed for labor, while others were forced into roles that kept the system functioning, sorting belongings, maintaining infrastructure, or assisting under threat of death. The scale of the operation grew rapidly, with transports arriving daily from across occupied Europe. What had begun as a detention facility was now evolving into a mechanism of mass killing, concealed behind layers of secrecy, bureaucracy, and deliberate misinformation. By early 1942, Auschwitz-Birkenau had become the focal point of a system that operated with calculated precision. Trains arrived from across Europe, France, Hungary, the Netherlands, Greece, each carrying hundreds, sometimes thousands of people packed into sealed cattle cars. The journeys often lasted days without adequate food, water, or sanitation. Many did not survive the transport. Those who did were forced onto the selection platform, where SS officers determined their fate within seconds. A gesture to the left or right meant the difference between temporary survival and immediate death. The majority, especially the elderly, children, and mothers with young families, were sent directly to the gas chambers. Those deemed fit for labor were registered, shaved, stripped of personal belongings, and assigned to barracks where overcrowding, disease, and starvation were constant. The process was designed to dehumanize completely. Names were replaced with tattooed numbers. Identity was systematically erased. Prisoners wore uniforms marked with colored triangles that categorized them: Jews, political prisoners, Roma, and others, each group subjected to varying degrees of brutality. Daily life in the camp followed a rigid structure enforced by violence. Roll calls could last for hours in freezing or extreme heat, with prisoners forced to stand motionless regardless of exhaustion or illness. Work details ranged from construction and factory labor to physically punishing tasks intended to break the body. Food rations were minimal, often consisting of watery soup and small portions of bread, insufficient to sustain life under such conditions. Survival depended not only on physical endurance, but on navigating a system built on unpredictability and fear. Within this environment, a hidden structure existed among the prisoners themselves. Certain individuals were assigned roles by the SS: block leaders, capos, and work supervisors, positions that came with marginal privileges, but also placed them in morally complex situations. Some used their roles to help others where possible, sharing food or offering protection, while others enforced discipline with the same brutality as their captors. Resistance, though extremely dangerous, did occur. Small, covert acts, sharing information, sabotaging equipment, or documenting atrocities, became forms of defiance against a system designed to eliminate all opposition. Outside the camp, information about Auschwitz began to surface, though it was often dismissed or underestimated. Reports from escapees and underground networks described mass killings and inhumane conditions, but the scale was difficult to comprehend. Even among Allied forces, the full extent of what was happening remained unclear. Inside Auschwitz, however, the reality was undeniable. Smoke rising continuously from crematoria, the constant arrival of trains, and the disappearances of thousands each day made it clear that this was not simply a labor camp. It was a system operating with one primary objective, carried out in secrecy, but witnessed by those trapped within its walls. As 1943 progressed, Auschwitz reached a level of operation that reflected both expansion and refinement. The camp complex had grown into a vast network that included Auschwitz I, Auschwitz II-Birkenau, and Auschwitz III-Monowitz, along with dozens of subcamps connected to industrial sites. At Monowitz, prisoners were forced to work for German companies, such as IG Farben, producing synthetic rubber and fuel under brutal conditions. Labor was no longer just a function of imprisonment. It had become integrated into the German war economy. Prisoners were viewed as expendable resources, worked until exhaustion, and replaced when they could no longer continue. This system created a constant cycle. New arrivals were selected, the strongest were sent to labor, and those who weakened were eventually removed from the system. Meanwhile, Birkenau remained the center of mass killing. The gas chambers and crematoria operated at a pace that reflected the scale of deportations, particularly as transports increased from countries still under Nazi control. The procedures became more efficient, more concealed, and more systematic. Victims were often told they were being disinfected or prepared for relocation. Personal belongings were carefully catalogued, clothes, luggage, even hair, before being sent to storage areas known as Canada, where items were sorted for reuse or shipment back into Germany. Every aspect of the process was organized, down to the smallest detail, reinforcing the industrial nature of what was taking place. At the same time, the SS implemented strict control over information within the camp. Sonderkommando units, prisoners forced to work in and around the gas chambers and crematoria, were isolated from the rest of the camp population. They were compelled to assist in the most horrific parts of the process, guiding victims, removing bodies, and maintaining the facilities. These units were regularly replaced and killed to eliminate witnesses. Despite this, some members managed to document what they saw, secretly recording details or attempting to pass information to the outside world. One of the most significant acts of resistance occurred in October 1944, when members of the Sonderkommando launched an uprising, damaging one of the crematoria. Though the revolt was ultimately suppressed, it demonstrated that even within the most controlled and oppressive environment, resistance persisted. Across the camp, small networks continued to form, sharing news, supporting the sick, and preserving fragments of humanity in a place designed to destroy it. By this stage of the war, Auschwitz was no longer hidden in the same way it had been before. The scale of deportations, combined with scattered reports reaching Allied intelligence, made it increasingly difficult to deny what was happening. Yet for those inside the camp, the outside world still felt distant, and liberation remained uncertain. By mid to late 1944, the pace of deportations to Auschwitz intensified dramatically, particularly with the mass arrival of Hungarian Jews. In just a few months, hundreds of thousands were transported to Birkenau, overwhelming even a system already operating at extreme capacity. The infrastructure was pushed beyond its limits. Open-air burnings were used when crematoria could not keep up, and selections on the ramp became even more rapid and impersonal. The process no longer attempted to maintain any illusion of order for those who had already witnessed the patterns. Smoke thickened in the air, the smell of burning became constant, and the scale of disappearance was impossible to ignore. At the same time, the war was shifting. Allied forces were advancing from the west, while Soviet troops pushed closer from the east. Inside the Nazi leadership, awareness grew that the camps could soon be discovered. Orders were issued to begin dismantling evidence. Documents were destroyed, facilities partially taken apart, and efforts were made to reduce traces of what had taken place. Yet the scale of Auschwitz made complete concealment impossible. Too many people had passed through its gates, and too many had witnessed its operations from within and without. As the front lines approached in early 1945, the SS began evacuating the camp. Tens of thousands of prisoners were forced onto what later became known as death marches, long, brutal journeys through winter conditions with little food or shelter. Those who could not keep up were often shot along the way. The objective was clear: prevent prisoners from being liberated and keep them within the collapsing system as long as possible. Meanwhile, thousands who were too weak to move were left behind in the camp. On January 27, 1945, Soviet forces entered Auschwitz. What they found was not a functioning camp, but the remains of one. Around 7,000 prisoners were still alive, many severely ill, malnourished, and barely able to comprehend what was happening. Warehouses filled with confiscated belongings remained, piles of shoes, suitcases, and personal items that testified to the vast number of people who had passed through. The gas chambers and crematoria had been partially destroyed, but enough remained to reveal their purpose. Liberation did not immediately bring clarity. For survivors, the physical and psychological toll was immense, and the process of understanding what had happened, both for them and for the world, would take years. Auschwitz was no longer hidden, but the full reality of it was only beginning to emerge. In the immediate aftermath of liberation, Auschwitz became a site not only of survival, but of documentation. Soviet investigators, along with Polish authorities and surviving prisoners, began collecting evidence of what had taken place. Testimonies were recorded, physical remnants were catalogued, and efforts were made to reconstruct the structure and function of the camp system. What emerged was a level of organization that challenged comprehension. This had not been chaos or uncontrolled violence. It had been coordinated, recorded, and managed through official channels. Documents recovered from the camp and other Nazi offices revealed transport lists, construction plans, and correspondence that confirmed Auschwitz's role within a broader network of extermination and forced labor. Survivors spoke of selections, daily routines, punishments, and the constant presence of death. Their accounts, though sometimes fragmented by trauma, aligned in ways that reinforced the scale and consistency of what had occurred. Outside the camp, the global response began to shift as these findings were made public. Images and footage taken during and after liberation were shown to populations that had, until then, only received limited or unclear information. The reality of Auschwitz forced a confrontation with the consequences of policies that had been implemented gradually, often hidden behind language that obscured their true intent. In the years that followed, Auschwitz became central to the legal and historical reckoning that emerged after the war. During the Nuremberg trials, evidence from Auschwitz was presented as part of the prosecution's case against key figures in the Nazi regime. The camp stood as a clear example of crimes carried out on a systematic scale, supported by documentation, witness testimony, and physical remains. Subsequent trials, including those held in Poland and West Germany, focused more specifically on individuals who had worked within Auschwitz itself. These proceedings further clarified how the camp operated and who was involved at different levels. At the same time, efforts were made to preserve the site. Sections of the camp were converted into a memorial and museum, intended not only to honor those who had suffered and died, but to serve as a permanent record. Historians, researchers, and educators continued to study Auschwitz in detail, examining not just the events that occurred there, but the structures that allowed them to happen. The story of Auschwitz did not end with liberation. It became part of a larger effort to understand how such a system could be created, maintained, and carried out in the modern world. As decades passed, Auschwitz became more than a historical location. It became a reference point in discussions about memory, responsibility, and the limits of human behavior under systems of power. Survivors who had once struggled simply to rebuild their lives began sharing their experiences publicly, ensuring that what they had witnessed would not be reduced to statistics or forgotten over time. Their testimonies added depth to the historical record, offering perspectives that documents alone could not provide. These accounts described not only the structure of the camp, but the daily reality of living within it, the uncertainty, the fear, and the small, often overlooked moments of humanity that persisted despite everything. At the same time, historians continued to analyze newly discovered materials, refining the understanding of how Auschwitz functioned within the broader framework of Nazi policy. It became increasingly clear that the camp was not an isolated anomaly, but part of a system that relied on coordination between government agencies, industry, and individuals at multiple levels. This realization shifted the conversation from viewing Auschwitz as a singular event to recognizing it as the result of decisions made over time, supported by structures that enabled and sustained it. Today, Auschwitz stands preserved as a memorial and museum, visited by millions each year. The physical space remains largely intact: barbed wire fences, barracks, guard towers, serving as a direct connection to the past. Walking through the site, visitors encounter not only the scale of the camp, but also the personal traces left behind: names, photographs, and belongings that represent individual lives. Education plays a central role in how Auschwitz is remembered, with ongoing efforts to present its history accurately and responsibly. As the number of living survivors continues to decline, the responsibility of preserving their stories shifts to documentation, archives, and future generations. Understanding Auschwitz is not about revisiting the past in isolation, but about recognizing the conditions that allowed it to exist and the importance of preventing such systems from emerging again. The secrets that were once hidden behind its gates are now part of the historical record, studied, documented, and acknowledged. What remains is the responsibility to remember them with clarity and to ensure that they are neither distorted nor forgotten.